Hello, and welcome to Keep the Channel Open, a podcast featuring conversations about art, literature, and creativity. My name is Mike Sakasagawa, and this is episode 136. Today's guest is Abby Miner. Hey there, folks. Welcome to the show. Today's guest is poet Abby Miner. Abby Miner lives in the ridges and valleys of central Pennsylvania, where she works on poems, essays, drawings, and projects exploring reproductive politics. Granddaughter of Appalachian tinkerers and Yiddish-speaking New Yorkers, she serves on the board of the internationally active organization Abortion Conversation Projects, co-directs an arts education nonprofit called Ridgelines Language Arts, and in 2018 was awarded Bitch Media's Writing Fellowship in Sexual Politics. Her first book is As I Said, a Dissent, published by Ricochet Editions in 2022, a collection of long documentary poems concerning abortion, justice, and citizenship in her matriline and in U.S. history. I read As I Said, a Dissent earlier this fall, and it was an interesting experience. As you'll hear Abby and I talk about in our conversation, the discourse around abortion and the kinds of stories that are told about abortion tend to fall within a fairly prescribed set of parameters. And yet, this book felt very different to me. The poems here are both personal and historical. They are about abortion, yes, but they are also about lineage and family, about place and culture, and I think that the way that these poems place the event of an abortion within such a broad and deep context allows them to do something remarkable, to talk about as fraught a subject as abortion in a way that truly feels different. I found the reading of this book a valuable experience, and I hope you'll feel the same way. A few notes before we start. There are links in the show notes to give you some options in ordering your own copy of As I Said, a Dissent. You'll find links to order from Webster's Bookstore in State College, Pennsylvania, from the Book Catapult here in San Diego, and from bookshop.org. Also, if you enjoyed today's conversation and would like to hear more from Abby, she recently appeared on NPR's Arts and Letters podcast to discuss the long poem from this book, Once in a Black Silk Gown, and there's a link in the show notes for that. Finally, for subscribers to our Patreon, Abby has added a reading to our bonus audio archive, an excerpt from a work in progress called Working It. You can find that reading at patreon.com/likewisemedia, where the full bonus audio archive is available to subscribers at the $2 per month level and above. That includes readings from writers like Luther Hughes, Carrie Wason, Matthew Salises, Ross Sutherland, Kia Brown, Rachel Zucker, and many more. All right, let's get started. Here's my conversation with Abby Miner. I really enjoyed reading this book. I've read it through a couple times now, and I found it a really interesting experience, in particular because documentary poetry is just not a sort of genre that I was familiar with or even knew existed before this book. But I found the reading of it just a fascinating experience. And we'll get into it a little more, but I was hoping we could start with the reading.
Mm-hmm. And I'll just something that pops to my mind that I want to say, Mike. I came to poetry a little bit late, I guess. I didn't study it when I was an undergraduate student. And the very first poetry class I took as a grad student was a class on documentary poetry. And so that was like my first introduction to poetry. And sometimes I wonder, like, oh, that might have been the vein I fell into because, just it was what I first encountered. Yeah. So I thought I would read the first couple of pages from a longish poem or a medium-sized poem called Hours that is maybe more properly a prose poem or maybe even a series of lyric essays. Sometimes I say that this poem is based on interviews with my mom and grandma about their experiences with abortion pre-Roe v. Wade. And it is, I did talk with both of them, although with my grandmother, I wasn't interested in the subject of abortion until after she had already died. So I had these recordings that in truth weren't really interviews. Really, I had just taken a tape recorder to her house and hit record while we were hanging out on several occasions. But so then with my mom, I did sit down and actually sort of do a proper interview. But with my grandma's story, I went back and listened to these recordings that have everything from the TV in the background talking about Michael Jackson's death, which had happened at the time I was recording, and electoral politics, and my grandma yelling at the TV and smoking cigarettes, kind of these crazy recordings where felt like I was sifting through to find maybe some clues or, and it's not that she wouldn't have talked to me about it, but, as I said, I just hadn't asked her specifically. So this poem is, over the years, I kind of came to think it's not even really so much about their experiences with abortion, although that's part of what the poems circle around, but really it's about their whole lives as people with wombs, as people with hearts, as people with minds, as people with family members, and it's also kind of about my grandmother's love for Manhattan, where she grew up. So it's a lot of things, but I'm going to read the first 2 pages of this poem.
Okay.
Would there was a plural for her, so that I could say, minding the ark, minding her red stalk, and it could mean multiple hers, like theirs and also ours, minding ours, stalk of red, the contours, the star glass, the blinking rose. Sex is never safe, but neither is time, and nor are flowers. In their abstract figures, the mammoth, shining kingdom of family and the abject, bloody queendom of abortion reign over the American landscape like movie stars. The mood is orchestral, his hand on the small of her back, a painted skyline, feathers, shadows peeled from brick, shadows licked and stuck to chenille. Does abortion do everything family does, only backwards, in heels? What was first called purple was more like our deep red. So blood was purple, the vein and the veil. I thought I could write a story about my country and its bodies, sans explication, to destroy explication with purple flowers, and after the destruction to unfold the hours, to find the pinion word in an acre of thought. So that's kind of a preamble to the poem, and then each section just has a subtitle that's either Ruthie or Judith, which Ruthie was my grandmother's name and Judith is my mother's name. Ruthie 1. My grandmother loved Ginger Rogers and Fred Astaire, Esther Williams, Aqua Alto, Sequins and Chlorine, American Spirits, the Atlantic Ocean, telemarketers, barrettes. Her TV antenna tipped with foil, and every 9 minutes the next Newark jet passing over, the next 100-girl kick line scissoring across the screen. Didn't we all know that Ruthie had had an abortion? That she had less to do with the kingdom than the queen? I don't remember how we knew that, but we knew that, says my mother. I just remember knowing. Knowing as a spirit knows, a known tobacco puff, in that 5-room Linden bungalow torn down, wires, windows, walls, all, after her death. Her daughters and her daughters' daughters, laughing and knowing. Knowing busted sidewalks and azaleas, pink petals thin as rolling papers, which we pinned in our hair. Pinned her polyester scarves around each other to make gowns. Obsessed with the picture, but going on the sound. 4 brown and white girls running her schmatas up our bodies like flagpoles. What were we but the nation's dance routine? Ruthie called us the queen, the dream, the brilliant, and the rose. Before my sister got the Hebrew character for rose tattooed on her wrist, the tattooist asked her to double-check. So often do people get unfamiliar alphabets permanently wrong. It's true, none of us know Hebrew from Adam, although I do know that Dam means blood. I do remember that we called her Madam, which means we called her Mother Blood. Several times I took a tape recorder to her house and didn't mention it. Its red blink tucked between the ashtray and the crosswords, between the ashes and the going over jets, between the door and the veil, with my want. What did I want? Her voice, the obliterating river of it. Grandma, if you and Ben never went to synagogue and never took Mommy and Aunt Claire to synagogue and never said the prayers, what has it meant to you to be Jewish? Loudly, on her death cot, it just feels good to be Jewish. And then, As I said, whatever stage you are in your life, recognize the garbage and get rid of it.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
One of the things that I thought a lot about with this book is, so the bulk of the book is taken up by the second section, which is the sort of most obviously and most directly about abortion, and is most obviously documentary, I would say, insofar as you as the writer are presenting us, the reader, with a story that is historical and that we might not necessarily be familiar with, just in the same way that, like watching a documentary film or whatever we might do, right? Reading that second section, there's enough going on in there in terms of making a political statement, but in a complex way, conveying historical information, poetic form, all of that stuff is happening in that second section. So it would be enough, looked at one way, to just have that second section sort of stand by itself. And yet you have the first, third, and fourth sections in this book as well. And, so in this fourth section that you've just read from is a story of, as you said, your mother's and grandmother's abortion experiences, but really more than that. And the way that you, with these other sections, and then also even interspersed within the second section, are bringing in these really personal and sort of more oblique stories into this thing that could just be sort of a more intellectual or historical kind of telling, right? Is really, I think, what made the whole book more sort of interesting and really deepened the experience for me. And I wanted to talk a little bit to start with, sort of what your thought process was in including all of this other stuff that isn't necessarily obvious to someone else why this would be in a book that is at least ostensibly about abortion. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Oh man, yeah, Mike, where to start? First of all, I'll say, not only is there the first and the third and the fourth section, there was like a fifth and a sixth and a seventh and eighth section over the years. So I think one simple answer is that I've learned over the years writing and, being community with other writers that, some folks, any kinds of artists tend towards minimalism, I think, and some folks tend towards maximalism. And those are kind of two beautiful artistic lineages. And I definitely am an inheritor of a lot of maximalist tendencies. So I think in a lot of ways, the main questions that were driving me when I wrote all of the pieces in this book were, what is an abortion story and what is poetry? And what is an abortion story? Because as soon as I had my own experience with abortion, or even before I even had the procedure, but knew that I was going to have an abortion, I started writing about that experience. And even for a couple years was writing about that experience without bringing in any of these other threads. And after a while, I started to realize that I needed a bigger palette to tell this story. And even there's kind of a script, I think, when you tell an abortion story in public. And I think a lot of activists in recent years have kind of been pushing back against this script and saying, we can tell our stories however we want. But at least at the time when I was trying to figure out how to tell this story, it felt like, there's sort of some things you're supposed to say. How old were you? And, what was your partnership status? And, why did you not want to have a child? And all these things. And I really chafed against that and felt like, that's really not the story. And so I started reading about histories of abortion because I just on some intuitive level felt like even to understand my own experience, I need to understand this in a much bigger way. And so the second poem, which is called Once in a Black Silk Gown, a film noir, and documents the life of a woman named Ann Lohman, who was a pretty infamous abortion provider in Manhattan in the 19th century. She was also known as Madame Restell. When I came across her in reading, that felt like a character who just really intrigued me and really would allow me and did allow me to kind of play with a lot of the questions I had about America and reproductive politics and those histories that are still with us, and the way that racial politics and reproductive politics intersect, and class politics and all these things. But it was really important to me, again, I think, to sort of like challenge like the boundaries of like what counts as an abortion story, you know? And I think this is true for any kind of story, you know, all of us, I think, who write stories or make art, or, you know, what detail belongs in the story and what detail doesn't is always kind of this question. Sometimes I tell myself, like, the major questions of writing are like what order to put things in and what to leave out, which sounds easy, but isn't. And I guess I felt like I wanted I wanted as much as possible in this book, and I wanted to be able to associate abortion with a lot of different threads. I was going to say history and mysticism, but maybe mystery is actually the word I was looking for. History, mysticism, theology, you know, my own familial histories, my matriline. But yeah, again, these different intersecting kinds of politics over the centuries. And so, yeah, it was important to me. A couple of people over the years said, oh, the Once in a Black Silk Gown poem about Madame Restell could stand on its own and would stand on its own. But it was important to me to, include as many other threads as seemed relevant to me. And a lot of other threads did seem relevant, you know, including for me, the realization that there was and is a lot of pressure on white women to reproduce. And so I think in a pretty nuanced way, the first cycle in the book, kind of one of my intentions with that first poem cycle, which is called Real Words for Inside, was to kind of name that part of my experience before moving into the history of actually, you know, abortion originally being outlawed in the late 19th century because of the desire for white women to have more children, or to prevent white women from not having children, was one of the big arms of the original anti-abortion movement.
There's a number of things here that I'm trying to decide what direction to go off in from what you were just talking about. One of the things that I'm sort of struck by in the way that Once in a Black Silk Gown is structured, right, is the way that the past and the present sort of sit together, right? That it starts off with the whole first sort of section of that poem is very much sort of providing a frame narrative. It's not starting off with the history. It's starting off with the documentary process itself. And throughout, you return to yourself in the present moment of, which is now the past moment, I guess, of researching and writing this poem. And you also are bringing in and making parallels between the rhetoric of the past and the rhetoric of the present. For example, you bring up Joel Osteen at one point and how he talks about the young women that he's sending cards to. And you mention the House Investigative Panel on Infant Lives and how they are talking to the Planned Parenthood's director, Cecile Richards. And even this thing that you've just mentioned, the sort of, you know, replacement theory underpinnings and eugenics underpinnings of the original anti-abortion movement, how that was very much, I mean, a lot of people don't actually know this, but even, you know, going back to immediately post Roe, when the Republican Party decides to really make that a sort of a platform issue for themselves, it wasn't originally considered to be a particularly party-based thing, but because of the way that they could tie it to this sort of white anxiety about being replaced, using that cynically to create a base of power for themselves. You know, how all of these things are sort of sitting together and the past and the present continue to echo through each other. I feel like that is something that really underpins the whole thing, definitely in Once in a Black Silk Gown, but really through all of the collection as a whole. I want to sort of see if that sort of sparks anything for you, you know, like if that, you know, brings anything up for you.
I think that's something that we see in many, many realms of, you know, I can only really speak for a U.S. context because that's, where I live and what I study, but, these long narratives that change shapes and take on different faces, but that we can really trace back for centuries. Again, racial politics, reproductive politics. And I guess I'll say a few things about writing that historical poem. I mean, on the one hand, the reason I'm trying to kind of make the documentary process clear there is partly just because I didn't have a ton of other material to work with, or I found myself sometimes coming up against like, okay, I have these materials, I have this newspaper article or this court transcript, but I really early on had to decide, I'm not going to be able to uncover the true Ann Lohman and I didn't even really want to, but even if I had wanted to, there's not really a lot of material there. And so it was kind of out of necessity to write myself as like a documenter into it because that's what I had the most information about. And I found early on that I wasn't particularly interested in sort of doing this thing where I like looked at these historical events and then kind of vivified them through poetry. That wasn't really sitting well with me. Partly maybe because a lot of the poets I love come out of a kind of talky, I think probably what people would call the New York school sort of talky, poetry where, the poet's voice and wonderings and revisions and stuff are all part of it. And that is often, I think, kind of thought about in a bit of a different realm from documentary poetry. I think documentary poetry often tends to be a little more serious and, okay, now I'm going to, show you these events through poetry. And I guess I kind of wanted to mush those two styles together. And I was like, well, I want to be able to, talk like Tim DeLugos or Eileen Miles a little bit, but also be doing this documentary investigation. And so, partly it was a style thing for me, I guess, wanting to remain in that style. And again, also just sort of like, well, the information I have, I have this little bit of information about this historical figure, but I have a lot more information about, what I'm doing here, taking a bath, thinking about her. And so it kind of just became a natural part of the process to work that in. And at a certain point, I was really inspired by the poet Brenda Coltis, who frames a number of her poems as films. And I think when I eventually decided to frame this poem as a film, the subtitle is a film noir. And that really seemed to fit, in the real film noir genre. We often have like a sort of morally ambiguous character. It's filmed a lot in black and white, and there's a lot of kind of geometric shots going on. And so I sort of played with that once I settled on that. And thinking of myself as a filmmaker helped me understand, what I could do and say and how I could make the things I was learning about feel vivid and lively without I didn't really want to make up too much, which sounds funny as a poet, because like everything we do, we make up, or I think making things up is great. A student of mine once said like, hey, I don't want to hurt your feelings, but when you write a poem, are you just making it up? And I'm like, yeah, so I certainly don't mean to dismiss imagination, but I think with that particular poem, I didn't want to like make up, like imagine like Ann Lohman, goes to the market or, it just wasn't really where I felt called. So I think positioning myself as a filmmaker helped me to understand what I could do with the material and play with it in a way that felt fun and engaging for me and hopefully for others too. And making myself a character, it was like, maybe because I had been writing lyric poetry in some form or another for years, that's kind of also what I knew how to do. Like the lyric I knew how to do that. And so there she was too, right along with. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So often in poetry, we're really, as readers, counseled not to read too much into the word I, right? To sort of separate the speaker of the poem from the poet. And I feel like
I struggled with that so much when I got to grad school, because I was like, I was like, it is me. I don't, I'm probably still not supposed to say that, I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, I think that even with something like this, where it is a little bit more sort of obviously and concretely that the I of the poem and the poet are collapsed a little more, I think it's still probably useful to try to be mindful of that distinction, just because, I mean, there's no way that a poem or any piece of art or even a whole body of work could ever completely encapsulate what it means to be a person. I do sort of feel like there's...
Yeah, and thank goodness, right? Because what it means to be a person is such a mess, you know? So, yeah, in that sense, I mean, I guess I would say, I think one of the reasons that even though there's, you know, this part of me that is like, well, yeah, it's me, you know? At the same time, I think one of the reasons I've developed like what I would describe as maybe kind of a wacky eye or like a little bit of a performative eye is because I think, or I hope that, you know, just that bit of wackiness kind of signals this is a performance. And also I think positioning myself as a filmmaker helped with that too, or positioning the investigator, the speaker in that poem as a filmmaker. It was sort of like Mr. Rogers, like putting on his different outfit. Do you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Like, hey, I'm coming into this poem and I'm like putting on this filmmaker hat just so the kids don't think that like TV's real.
Yeah. Yeah. But I mean, I feel like this poem in specific, but really the book as a whole, it feels to me that part of the project of this book is to be sort of aiming a little bit more at a complete picture than what we would typically get from the way that abortion discourse goes. Because there's so much, for example, like, you know, you could say that the fourth section that you read from is, in the simplest terms, it's a sort of juxtaposition of three women's abortion experiences. But I mean, it is that, but it's also not that at all, right? Because it's like this whole complex story of a history of a family coming to America from Europe. It's a history of an individual person's life who, yes, she had an abortion, but I mean, it's almost, in her case, like more time is almost spent on like what kinds of musicals she liked than on that, you know?
Totally. Yes. And I think there's an abortion provider named Charlotte Taft who's done a lot of really brilliant work. She lives down in the southwest somewhere. And she says something in an interview somewhere like, you know, abortion is like the hole in the donut. And then like women's lives are like the substance of the, you know, donut, which it always just makes me laugh because, I don't know, a donut is a funny analogy, but that was exactly it. I mean, I think in some ways, when I first started to write this book, I actually had this rule, like I wasn't going to use the word abortion at all. And it was out of this refusal of like, I don't want to get stuck in any kind of normative abortion discourse. Like I want to like fly over that. And I want to like bring this experience into like a whole different context where like the main questions we're normally asking in an abortion discourse are like, when does life begin? And like, is someone who has an abortion like a good or bad person? And I felt like those questions, I just couldn't care less. And for a long time, the writing that I was doing, none of which really made it into this book, but for a long time, I think the writing that I was doing was really having arguments with people about those questions in some way or another and feeling really combative about those questions and bothered that those questions were always on the table. And eventually, you know, I think I realized like, but what I really want to do is take this into another realm where when we say abortion story, we mean the musicals my grandmother loved, or we mean an exploration of like high femininity or performative femininity, which happens a lot in the book. Or, you know, questions about boundaries and bodies and authority. I mean, abortion is a really, really rich subject if we allow it to be spiritually in terms of a negative gesture. Like what is the significance in any person's life of a negative, all sorts of negative gestures and positive gestures, the things we do, the things we don't do. I really wanted with the poem that's circles around my mom and grandma to place abortion in the context of lineage. You know, for me, it was important when I had an abortion to realize sort of at the last minute, like, oh, wait, I'm like a third generation aborter. And that felt really beautiful and important to me. And that's actually where that poem came from, was just like, wow, that piece of information like got me through the picket line. You know what I mean? And so wanting to just honor that at the same time, not wanting to romanticize family. I think that's a concept that it's not super important to me, nor is it important really to my family, which is maybe where I get that from. But I did want to honor that abortion could happen in a lineage. Obviously abortion is posited as being like the enemy of the family in like quite literal terms in kind of right discourse. So it felt important to me to bring it into that fold.
One of the things that I was sort of interested in as I was sort of preparing for our conversation today and reading a lot of other stuff that you have written, one of the first things I read was this interview that you did with Erin Marie Lynch, who was your editor for this, and that you had said in there that the part of this that took the longest to write, it took you 6 years to write, was the third section, which is called Blood Dress, a Diary, which is the part that is sort of most directly, like if you could call any part of this your abortion story, that would be the part of it that is. And there's even, I noticed this on the reread that at the end of that section, you even have dates on there, which indicates a 6-year span. I hadn't really realized that at the first time through, but that you have actually written about your abortion story in different ways prior to this. And so if I take those dates at the end of Blood Dress, a Diary, ending in 2019, you have pieces that are published like a couple years earlier, a lyric essay called On This Red Edge. And you have a personal essay called Rooms that won Best of the Net in 2018. I think that was also published in 2017. And what's interesting to me is that, like, with all of these, you did an interview about Rooms with Contrary Magazine after you won the Best of the Net. And in that, even, you were talking about wanting to present an abortion story differently and without the same sort of central questions that are so common in the sort of standard abortion story narrative. The where, the why, the I'm still a good person kind of stuff. And yet in those two, the lyric essay and the personal essay, and then this poem, they're all presenting things about the same sort of experience, but in very different ways. And I would say there's a lot more concrete sort of narrative information in the previously published pieces than there are in this one, where this one feels like there's almost a lack of narrative detail at all. It's more impressionistic. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about what does writing in these different forms facilitate or inhibit about this sort of thing, about what does each form offer to you as the writer? And maybe if you're willing to go there, what do you feel like it might offer to the reader? Like how does the form interact with the subject matter, and how does it impact the meaning or the message that you're trying to communicate, or like, I mean, I don't know if that is like a easy thing, especially because, if you're talking about how it might impact the reader, you can only really guess at that. But I'm sort of getting at not necessarily why'd you do that, but just sort of like, what does it do for you as the writer? Does that make sense?
I know for me, I'm always kind of ricocheting between clarity and opacity. And I think probably a lot of artists meander that continuum. And it's true, some of the work that I've published before, has a little more narrative clarity just about who am I, where am I, what's happening. I'm remembering because I don't know if you have this experience, Mike, but I feel like making a work of art is maybe a little bit akin to how they say labor is. There's that joke people make, which I haven't given birth, so maybe this isn't true, but people say, oh, if you remembered, what it was like, you wouldn't do it again. That's probably like an off joke, and probably a lot of people who've given birth would say like, maybe there's something problematic about that. I don't know. But I think I at least feel it's true for writing a book is all I'm getting at. Often I think like, wow, how did this happen? I do know that I was interested in, like, in these 4 parts of the book, there's 4 different kinds of I. And the I in the diary in Blood Dress is the most opaque and is the closest to a kind of spirit I. And I'm not sure why that level of indirection. I mean, I think maybe because my experience of abortion was kind of, I guess in a way what I want to say is like, if it were possible to clear all the bullshit away, the stigma and the picketers and everything, what would be left? I'll say, well, for me, what would be left was like this experience of the beauty of a negation. And that is a very abstract thing. And so in some ways and also because the product of an abortion or of any kind of negation isn't tangible. And so I think by the time, I got to putting this book together, it felt like a lot of kinds of explication or argument or humor or whatever had happened in all these other parts of the book. And I think for this section, and it is true, like I spoke about with Erin, my editor, who I just want to take a side note and say I feel so lucky to have worked with her. I think poets don't often get the pleasure of having an editor, and she was a really, really brilliant editor. But in a lot of ways, I think a simple answer is, this poem took the longest to write because it was the hardest to write, because it was the hardest to deal with my own, not only like a numinous experience is hard to write about, but also a traumatic experience is hard to write about. And I always want to be careful to say, for me personally, the traumatic part of having an abortion was the fear and the secrecy and having to go a long way and having to walk through picketers. And I mean, that was like, whoa. I mean, sometimes I say it's like there was this electric fence all around me my whole life that I didn't know existed until suddenly I reached out and there it was. And so in some ways, I think I'm in that poem, my desire was to convey sort of both like the numinousness and the beauty of like, making a decision, making a reproductive decision that is a negation, and then also doing that in a context of really severe stigma and like doing your best to protect yourself from stigma and being wounded, allowing yourself to be wounded. I think the voice in that section is the quietest voice, maybe for that reason. And as much as I said, like, in some ways, the historical poem, I kind of have joked, like, well, it was easier with the Madame Restell poem to work on something where your enemies are already dead, Whereas, with my contemporary experience, it's like, oh, the people who, I'm a people pleaser. So to have people, screaming at you is really not where it's at. And I think for a long time, I really did not know how to reckon with that. And, my mom and grandma are the kind of people who will be like, fuck those people, And I wish, in some ways, writing this book, I was like trying to charm myself into being able to have a bit of that stance. And I think thinking about abortion and thinking about the politics of abortion has made me realize, like, yeah, you can love people and you can be willing to think about other people's perspective. But when someone else's perspective is that like you're evil or that you shouldn't exist, you really have to be able to draw a line. And I think in some ways the poem Blood Dress is like also about that tender process of even trying to learn to draw a line when that's not really your tuning. My tuning is sort of to be like, I love you, come over for tea. But it's like, you can't do that with people who hate you, in your mind or it's like you gotta have some armor. And I think this poem is like the most vulnerable because it's maybe also about like the process of developing or trying to have some armor. And it ends, with the moment of like the most moment of having armor, of having to just like get out of the car and walk through those people.
Yeah. What I was thinking about, you had said just now that there's a sort of obscurity to the poem. And in terms of narrative detail, there is a lot that is obscured for certain. And I know that, a lot of people, especially people who aren't necessarily reading poetry a lot or who want to make a certain kind of like a simple political understanding of things, will want to know like, well, what happened? Mm-hmm. It's a similar kind of thing when people write fiction that has autobiographical elements or that pulls from autobiographical elements. They'll instead of engaging with the story as a story, the thing that they'll focus on is which parts of this really happened, which is sort of like incidental to the actual story as story. I think here, what really struck me is that as much as the narrative detail might have been obscured, the poem itself doesn't feel obscure to me. And I think the reason is because it's not trying to explicate a narrative like of a factual story, but rather it seems to me that this poem is trying to convey something about an emotional experience.
Yeah, it's like I haven't said it this way before, Mike, but just talking to you now, I'm thinking like it's like a document of, I guess I'm repeating what I said a minute ago, but I think now that it's a document of surviving a traumatic experience or surviving stigma, I guess, not to say that I totally still experience abortion stigma. Like, even though I like compulsively talk about abortion to everyone, I still am afraid before I, mention abortion often, or, I have this flag that says, "Don't tread on me," with the snakes in the shape of uterus, because that's the flag everyone around here flies. So I was like, well, I'll fly my version, but I like put it up and take it down, put it up, take it. I have this fear, but also really want to communicate and also really want to hear other people's communications. But I think, yeah, and I'll just say, I mean, for me, some of the writing that was most comforting for me and, I felt most seen, or solidarity was like a collection of essays, I think that's called like "Get Out of My Crotch" or something, that is these really straightforward essays of like, I was 19 or I was 35 or, this and this happened. And I love that. Still to this day, I have a book right now that I just got called "Focus on Abortion" by a photographer named Rosalind Banish. And I love it. It's just like photographs of people who've had abortions and interviews with them about their abortions. And even then people talk about, there's details I share, there's details I don't share, but they're like really straightforward. And I love them so much. And for, a lot of different reasons, that's just not what came out for me in this iteration of telling. But I do think it's because my goal was to kind of document what it looks like to grapple with stigma and to maintain your own meaning of something, even in the face of like these really heavy external meanings. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, it always has struck me, I shouldn't say always, but it does strike me that really most of us, our experience of life is not as a factual narrative, but rather that our experience of life is an emotional narrative, right? That it is like we experience everything we experience emotionally, regardless of how people may want to say that that's not true, especially men want to say that that's not true. But like everything we experience through an emotional lens. And so to me, especially this third section, it doesn't feel obscure because it, perhaps in describing an emotional experience with this kind of immediacy that really only poetry can achieve, it is very clear,
I'm glad that you say that. I mean, I really do go back and forth between how clear to be, how obscure to be, just in general in making art. And I love art that really spans the whole gamut. I mean, like Alice Notley is one of my favorite poets, but I love Mary Oliver too. And, and I love like Naomi Shihab Nye, and I love, so I think I've tried over the years to remember that, there's just so many infinite ways to tell a story. And like you're saying, which I really appreciate you kind of honing in on this, there's a lot of different reasons to tell a story. And one of them could be to like capture the kind of, like, I'm sort of almost thinking of like fingerprints, like the emotional fingerprints of the experience,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So we're close to time on the first segment here, but there's something that I wanted to talk about, and I hope it's not a boring question.
Yeah, no, go for it.
So in addition to being a writer, you describe yourself as an advocate and activist. You founded a nonprofit. Actually, looking at your bio, I think you may have founded multiple nonprofits, but the one that
only one. That's why I only have like half gray hair.
Okay. Well, so this one that you are the founding director of Ridgelines Language Arts, you're providing language arts instruction or things like that to people who might not otherwise have access to it. And one of the things that I noted on the About Us page was this line about how the study of language arts prepares the way for social change. Mm. And I'm a person who has been involved in activism as well, and I'm a person who considers himself to be an artist. And so thinking about art as activism, can art be activism? is something that's on my mind a lot. However, I think that question phrased that way is a boring question.
But I so get it. It's like, it's not the question, but it is the question. It's like, how do our art and our activism intersect? And sometimes we feel like our activism is stealing time from our art. And I don't know if you feel that, but, or vice versa. But sorry, you finished the question.
Well, what I'm thinking about here is that, like, you know, in researching this, like, there's a lot of things that you've written about. And I mean, I don't know if you were the one who drafted the About Us page for Rich.
Oh, yeah, I did.
Okay. So there's that line about the study of language arts preparing the way for social change, but then that's immediately followed by art isn't action, but it can sort of precipitate action. In something like you did a book review, it was 3 books, and the title of the review was Beyond Choice. And in that you talked, especially in discussing the first book, you were talking about how sort of the imagination of the white feminist reproductive activist is limited partially by the language of quote unquote choice, but that's actually a symptom of a larger inability to imagine outside of their own experience, right? And a privileged experience at that. In your piece that you wrote about the culture of death for Bitch Media, you were talking about the limitations, again, of how we do or don't talk about abortion in terms of like whether or not it is actually ending life. And like, if we could talk about that in a more nuanced way, like what could that enable for us? And so all of that brings me to this interview that you did with Contrary about your piece Rooms, the piece that you won Best of the Net for. One of the things you said towards the end of that was that writing is a way of actually changing the terms by which you feel and think, changing your interior landscape and offering the possibility for that kind of change to others. So you're talking about writing as a way of changing yourself as the writer, but then offering the possibility of the same change to your readers. So, you know, just like what you just said, you know, there is this relationship between a person's art and their activism. And rather than saying, can art be activism? What I'm kind of want to get my head around, even maybe just for my own understanding of my own stuff, you know, like, like what the shape of that relationship between is, and like, or maybe not what the shape of it is, but like a relationship, if you think about a relationship between people, like it actually is doing something, right? Like the relationship has a function, and it offers something to the people that are involved in that. And so like, I'm wondering for you, how do you think about this stuff?
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. First, I'll say, I think that some of the language, which I may or may not have credited on that page of Ridgelines, which is, this nonprofit that I founded and co-direct now, that language about preparing the way for change, I hope I'm remembering correctly. I think comes from Muriel Rukeyser's The Life of Poetry. Yeah.
Yeah, you did credit that.
Okay, thanks. Good. And I love that. And it reminds me of something also that Alice Notley says. She says something like, you know, we may be responding to crisis, but crisis can't be maintained for all of time. Or like a crisis, you know, you don't live your whole life within the homogeneity of crisis. That's the phrase she uses, the homogeneity of crisis. And so even if our art is responding to some kind of crisis, there actually is and must be space for registers other than crisis. I think of writing poetry, its function in my life, and I think of art making in general as probably most akin to something like yoga or meditation, which I think a lot of people are familiar with. Okay, what are the uses of those kinds of practices? Well, those kinds of practices, you know, prepare us, first of all, ourselves to be able to be in the world in a healthy way and to interact with others in a healthy way, and also to invite others into those practices. I started Ridgelines in order to invite others into those practices. I've been teaching poetry in low-income nursing homes since 2012. And when I think about that teaching, it's like, I do think of myself almost as like a meditation teacher or a chaplain, although, you know, I do not have formal training as a chaplain. I think it's a very peaceful way for people to spend time together. It's a peaceful way to spend time with yourself. So I think art is a fundamentally peacemaking activity, whether, you know, we practice it on our own or in collaboration with others. And I would say most activisms have as their end goal some forms, some manifestations of peace. I also think that art, I think some people some artists, maybe many artists, have really successfully utilized art in activist contexts in like a really one-to-one way. Like I think of June Jordan, who I love so much. Like some people would describe her as didactic. What I love about June Jordan is that she is kind of didactic, but still also just like really bizarre, but almost, you know, if you look at her collected work, I mean, 1 out of every 5 poems is like written on the occasion of the march on City Hall. You know, it's like these poems were like really like instrumental for literal, like what we think of as activist situations. So I think that can 100% be one way that art works. For me, I've been very aware of this kind of delicate divide, but like friendly divide between my writing about abortion and my activism about abortion, because I don't know how much of this book I would like read at a march. You know, I'm not sure how useful it would be in that context. I would like to live in a world where our politics are as artistic as aesthetic as possible, I should say, and where our aesthetics are like as political as possible. So I feel like I'm going for that. And for me, what that's meant, you know, with politics or with activism is to try to be inventive about like what the activist event or experience looks like. Like when Kavanaugh was, you know, elected to the Supreme Court, I got together with a group of folks here in like rural Northern Appalachia, and we had this like group hug for abortion access. So it wasn't like we're standing on the corner with signs, you know, but it was something where like we met in public and we did this thing, and in a very organic way, we wound up telling each other stories about our own experiences. And that felt like a very artistic moment of activism for me. Like I was proud of that event because it wasn't just like my body, my choice. And I think it felt authentic and I think people left it feeling the way that you feel when you read poetry that you love. So I guess, yeah, that's the end of my ramble there, Mike. But I feel like I have so many more things to say on that, because it's just like, it's a huge question in my life too. And like a huge, and like I said earlier, I mean, sometimes I feel like the organizing work that I do or the teaching work I do is like stealing time from my writing. And sometimes I get grumpy about that. And then I have to kind of recenter and remember like, well, you know, all of these activities share some pretty fundamental values and goals, and thinking of them so as like a family of tools, you know?
Yeah.
What do you think? I mean, yeah. How do you think about that?
I honestly haven't really come to much conclusion, especially because my creative work I would say that my creative work is political insofar as everything personal is political, but it's not overtly political. You know, it's not like explicitly, like I don't engage topics that most people would consider to be political.
Right. And honestly, I can say everything, you know, this book happens to be that, but I've sort of laughed. I'm like, man, no one's going to invite me to the march for my next book, you know?
But, you know, like, I guess one of the things that I think is that, well, activism, right, is something that is intended to achieve something in the world. It's meant to do something, right? And you're usually pretty clear on what the outcome is that you're trying to, even if you're not directly making it happen, that you're at least trying to contribute to this particular outcome happening. And I think that the making of art is not necessarily about making something happen in the world, about doing something in the world. But I do think that the like publishing of art or like the sharing of art, putting it into the world does have some kind of effect. And I think that like most artists, especially the ones that are honest with themselves, are not necessarily like completely clear on what it is that intended doing is.
No, and especially because I think importantly, and you know, I really would hate to pick on like quote unquote political poetry, because as I think this guy James Scully says, if you read a bad love poem, you don't conclude that like love and poetry don't mix, but you read like a bad political poem and you're like, oh, politics and poetry don't mix. So it's like, I would never, you know, I think everything, art and everything, but it is true that like when we make art, yeah, we're coming from a place of not knowing. And a lot of times when we do activism, we're coming from a place of like, we want this law to be passed. But I really do love thinkers like Rosa Luxemburg, her political vision was like, yeah, the revolution, the whole point is we don't know what's going to happen. And then that's where politics is kind of like art, you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think we could probably keep talking about this indefinitely, but let's take a quick break.
Okay.
And then come back and do the second segment.
Okay.
So for the second segment, I always invite the guests to bring a topic of their own, which could be whatever you'd like to talk about, whatever happens to be on your mind. So what would you like to talk about today?
Well, okay, Mike, I had a couple things that I wrote down, but the one that's kind of coming to the top is work and labor and art. And I think the reason that this is on my mind, I mean, I live in a place where a lot of people work in the trades. I live in a really rural agrarian community, and that's really awesome. And there's a lot of things I really love about it. And over the years, I've done, had various jobs that were sort of in the manual labor vein or whatever. But I also have to be honest with myself that I think for any artist, like you really battle in a broad way, like art and the work that is art making it has no value, right? Like in capitalism and neoliberalism, it barely has a value. And so as artists, we say like, oh, what are you working on? Or this is my work or whatever. And I think it takes a lot of, you gotta cheer yourself on a lot to do work that other people wouldn't call work. But I think over the years, I just have become interested in like what different people think of as their work, or what counts as work and what counts as play. I was looking at your beautiful photographs of your tea leaves, and you're like, this is what I do right before I get to work every day. But the photographs are also your work. And like even just thinking about like different kinds of work that you've done in your life, or that I've done, or that our families have done. And I think America has a weird anxiety about work. Like the people who as long as someone's making money, we think they're working hard. But of course, like there's not necessarily a one-to-one relationship there. So I guess that's, kind of a huge topic, but that's the thing that I wanted to bring and see if that sparked anything for you.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, this is stuff I think about all the time. And in particular, you mentioning that you live in an area where a lot of people are, more blue collar, my grandfather, my dad's dad was a farmer. My mom's dad was career Army. My mom's mom was a seamstress. So all of these things are very sort of present in me. I'm the first one of either of my parents, and the first one on my mom's side entirely to go to college. And that's not something that anybody has ever like held against me in my family, right? Like it's not like it was sort of like, well, you're not doing anything real. Well, you're going to go to college and,
in fact, you will go to college so that you can like get good work, or that's the idea, right? Like,
yeah. But there is sort of, for me, and always often has been, a sort of anxiety over whether or not the things that I spend my time on are real or authentic in some way. And in particular, because of the access that I had to education and stuff like that I was able to be more financially successful than my parents, who are people that I perceive as having worked much harder than I do. So there is a certain anxiety about those things. And then to take something that has so little economic value as something like art, especially my art, I mean, there's a certain point for me where I spent a lot of time, and sometimes still do when I'm talking to certain people, where I almost feel like I have to apologize for such frivolity.
Yeah. Totally. And and I find myself, like where I live, if someone says, what do you do? I'm like, oh, I'm a writer. I'm a poet. People laugh, like they think it's a joke,
Yeah.
Which is, that's okay. But yeah, I find myself maybe making fun of the work that I do, and I also sometimes ask myself this question, like, well, if I was getting paid for the exact thing I'm doing right now, would it count as work to me, to other people? And so, I guess it's also thinking about money and how, so much of how we think about what we do is tied up with that. And in some ways, like the rough beauty of art is that because, especially poetry, at least for me, it's like really detached. Novelist, you could like make it big, but with poetry, it's like, it's really pretty, like you're pretty much losing money. It's like there is a terrible and kind of maybe lovely like freedom, then of like something really being detached from money. And I think in a culture where like everything we do is supposed to be organized around making money, to like spend time doing something that doesn't make money, there's part of that can feel like, wow, okay, that means I must have really chosen this thing. But it also can mean, oh yeah, like what you said, I feel like I'm maybe apologizing for this frivolity, and yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think too, what you were just saying about, if I were making money on this, there is a degree to which doing creative work in a way that isn't sort of financially remunerative can help it feel more sort of pure and authentic. I mean, even something just like in terms of podcasting, I don't really make money on this podcast. I have a Patreon and I make just about enough money to cover the expenses of doing it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's it. And there is a way that, not having ads in the middle of the show, for example, helps it feel cleaner to me. It's not that I necessarily begrudge anyone who does run ads on their free content the opportunity to do that. But, it is something I think about a lot. And I kind of feel like it's a false dichotomy.
Yeah, I do too.
I mean, I think that, when I'm thinking about the dichotomy between, authenticity and financial success, right? It's like the question is like, I can feel like maybe because I'm not getting paid, I have sort of more of a complete editorial control over what I'm doing, because I'm not beholden to anyone. But then again, like, I don't necessarily think that the people who are successful as artists are like, would they be making different work if they weren't getting paid? Maybe not. Or maybe they would be making less authentic work because they'd be trying to get successful. It's hard to say. And at the end of the day, I don't even know if it's like an important question to ask,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. Like, I don't think it makes sense to, say, oh, okay, well, in this realm, there's like and it's like an old dichotomy, like, well, the purity of, just kind of struggling in obscurity or the potential sort of, I guess, sellout, people would say. It's not so much, it's not even that. It's just the funny thing of, it makes me think about all the work that people do that, they do out of love, whether it's paid or not, and all the different, just that we could expand our definitions of work and, what it means to be at work or hard at work or a hard day's work, And maybe the real thing is that our culture really needs to think more about rest.
Well, yeah, for certain. It's interesting because, I think a lot of, certainly people talk a lot about the sort of Puritan work ethic that is, America has really taken on. I'm not personally Christian, and I know you're not either, but, this is sort of like the sea that we swim in.
Yes.
And I think, I've actually thought a lot about this recently. I don't know what it is that keeps bringing it up for me, but how we have this idea of work in itself being somehow sort of
like virtuous.
Yes, that's the word I was looking for, right? And that idleness is wicked or sinful, right?
And then when your work is kind of a form of like dreamy idleness, or not even, I shouldn't say your work, but just a thing that you work at, there's kind of like a beautiful blur there, which I think like can be an interesting position from which to think about work and think about rest. And it does occur to me too, like, oh, the American anxiety about work is really about like, I've earned what I have, which nobody has, And it's like, if I've earned what I have, then I can say that like, oh, well, that person that's in like not such a great situation, it's because they didn't work hard enough, right? So it's like that whole, and then I think about, oh, wow, this like funny little anxiety I have about, am I working hard enough? Or do people see me as working? It's like, that comes from this huge water we swim in of this American anxiety about work, which is really, I think, probably an anxiety about slavery, which is that not only did, this is my we, not only do we not earn what we have, other people did, So maybe it's interesting to think about this anxiety about like, well, I work hard or da-da-da. It's all this fear that you don't deserve what you have. And I think actually maybe the best place to wind up is like, yeah, nobody deserves what they have, good or bad, or at least that there's a lot more nuance there, and I think when we are so attached to feeling like, well, I earned what I have, then we're like really much more quick to turn around and say someone's in whatever situation they're in because they didn't, quote, work hard enough.
Yeah. I think a lot about how, these sort of attitudes that we get from religion about, the virtuosity of virtuousness of work. To my mind, they probably come from the fact that historically people were living in a, subsistence agrarian kind of lifestyle where like if you don't work the land, then you're not going to eat, right? And that in a community where you're trying to work together in order to make sure that your whole community is being able to be fed by the fruits of your labor, then that is something that, idleness, I think you would see it in that context as, failing to contribute to your community, failing to like live up to the responsibilities that you have, not to yourself, but to your neighbors, right? And the context of the world that we live in now, where most of us are not living, even if we live in a more rural area, it's not really subsistence farming that we're doing, right? So,
although what's really interesting as you say that, Mike, I'm sorry to interrupt, but this is just like popping to my mind. A couple years ago, this is totally not my thought, but I'm getting it from this book, Ramp Hollow I'm going to actually look it up so I get the author's name right, like as I'm talking to you right now. Ramp Hollow, the subtitle is The Ordeal of Appalachia. It's by Stephen Stoll. And he actually talks about the history of, subsistence communities or like smallholder communities and how actually there was like that in that kind of system, there is a lot of rest or there is downtime, and because you're not having to, maximum profit isn't the goal. And actually that like when capitalism like started to really take hold, I'm going to say in the 1700s, I don't know anything about the history of capitalism, but this book has a history of capitalism in it. And if I'm remembering correctly, it's like all these narratives started to then spin out about like smallholders and agrarians being lazy and like they need to be forced to work to like exchange their labor for money. And otherwise, and you sort of see that today, like, well, why would, you could grow your own hazelnuts and like crack the nuts and whatever, but like you can buy them at the store for $8. Like, why would you do that? Like, it's sort of like you're supposed to be getting things for as cheap as possible and trading your labor for money. But actually in a system where those aren't the values, you maybe sell some of what you grow. And if it's raining, you don't work. And do you know what I mean? Like, I don't know if I'm painting the picture certainly as well as Stephen Stoll paints it. And I recommend the book Ramp Hollow. But that book really kind of blew my mind. And I guess that's why I started thinking about work. I read it a couple years ago. Just even this idea that like, there's been even still these narratives that like, well, you can't just like putter around and, what do agrarians do? Or like that agrarian communities there's always this pressure to like incorporate them into like the global economic system. Do you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. I think that's really sort of what I'm getting at in terms of like the context being different, because so I haven't read that book, but I did recently read Robin Wall Kimmerer's Braiding Sweetgrass. And while that doesn't touch on the idea of work necessarily, it is sort of talking about how communities can be organized around other things besides capitalism, and like stewardship of the land or community taking care of each other, things like that. And she has a lot of examples of indigenous communities in the Americas doing things like agriculture or foraging or basket weaving or all of these things in a communal way where there's sort of like not just the expectation, but like the desire to do things in order to support each other. But I think that taking that context where it's like you're starting from a place where, okay, we're living in these small communities that are basically just trying to survive and support each other as a community. and we're basing that our work around natural cycles of, of plowing and harvesting, right? And there's times for each of these things. I mean, that's even in the Bible, right? Like there, to everything there is a season.
Including rest. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But then you take it out of the context of like, we all know that we live in a culture where at this time you're going to be doing this thing, and at this time you're not going to be doing that thing. Right. And you put it into a context where that doesn't really necessarily apply, because we're now focused less on survival or stewardship or community and more on profit. And these lessons that we have from our ancestors, taken out of context, they mean something different, right? Like, if you're saying like we're you need to work when the rest of us are working kind of thing in order to like be part of the community, as opposed to you need to work just in order to maximize your profit kind of thing. It just means something totally different,
Yeah, totally. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, how do you kind of like push or play with those ideas of like work or rest in your life, Mike, if you do?
I am very bad at resting.
Me too.
And this is, if we want to talk about work culture, I mean, American work culture is one thing, but Japanese work culture is another thing too.
Yes. Yeah.
My family has been in the US for many generations now, but there are certain attitudes that get passed down about work ethic and stuff like that are very hard to get away from. And so my struggle has always been like, can I ever just like sit down and read a book or watch TV or anything and not feel like I'm wasting my time?
Yeah, totally.
Yesterday, so it's Sunday as we're recording this. Saturday is my normal like doing chores day. So I got up, I made myself breakfast, I made my kids breakfast, I did the dishes, I scrubbed my shower, and my toilets, and I vacuumed and I dusted, and I went and got groceries, and I spent the whole day like running around or doing like, physical labor around my house. And then at the end, like in between when I was supposed to make dinner for my kids and when I was done with my last grocery run, I sat down on a chair in my living room, and I did literally have the thought like what else do I have to be doing right now? And I thought to myself, like, I could just sit here and look at TikTok for half an hour, or I could read through this essay one more time just to make sure that my notes are right. And
Yeah. Well, it's so funny we started talking about work, but I think that the place this conversation is bringing us to, that, yeah, for me also has been a big question lately is like, wow, so what does it look like to rest? And like, what constitutes rest for me? Or it's a little tricky, I think, if you're a writer, because like words themselves are like, reading is loaded because it's like, well, this is the thing that I do. And so, yeah, I've been really like, what are restful activities? That's something I learn a lot from kids about that. I work with kids teaching just kind of these really anarchic, like after school art classes and summer camps and stuff. And I mean, I guess kids tend to be pretty like wildly like sort of quote unquote productive, but it's like this weird blend of like, I'm making 10,000 like paper snowflakes, nobody can stop me. but it's like, I don't think that they're at that age being driven by some sense of productivity. And so maybe I want to look to them for like this answer of like, what is like the kind of balance of like rest and productivity and play and work?
Yeah. And especially, considering, so much of the discourse around our politics has to do with, work and laziness and productivity. And it's like, who is this for?
Right. And like, why is productivity a value? Or like, why is that always a value? And producing what? And really money,
But even the money part, it's like, yes, if I go and I work a few extra hours, like, I mean, my job is salaried, so I'm not going to make any extra money, but, that does kind of speak to it, right? It's like, if I go work a little harder, I like the team that I work for, and I like the people that I work for, and I do want to do my part, but it's like, and I'm going to get my work done on as much on schedule as I can. But it's like, at the end of the day, if I spend more hours working on it, even if I did make more money because I was working more hours, like, it's really not that I'm working for myself. It's really more that I'm working for somebody else to make even more money than that, right? And so why is that a virtuous thing to do? I don't know.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's like a big question probably for all of us and many people listening, is just this question, like, why is productivity in and of itself this not only a value, but like God in our culture, you know?
Yeah.
And like de-escalating that is probably the work of a lifetime.
It's probably the work of
multiple lifetimes. Here we go. Yeah.
Oh, boy. Oh. Well, so the last question that I always like to end with is if there is a piece of art or literature or creativity that you've experienced recently that meant something to you.
Yeah. And maybe this is actually even has some lovely lesson in this conversation about work. So the thing that I want to tell you about, I have it right here with me. It's this book of photographs called Places for the Spirit, Traditional African American Gardens. And it's photographs by a photographer named Vaughn Sills, and there's a foreword by Hilton Als. And these are photographs of gardens that are throughout the American South, and they have a lot of, the photographer talks in the beginning of the book about like there being some sort of like characteristics that a lot of these gardens have in common, and that she kind of looked for some of these characteristics. But when I look at them, what I see is like this, I'll just try to explain so you can sort of see what I'm seeing. These are really like a combination of gardens, sculpture, yard art, or like the Southern Yard Show. I think that would be in that tradition. And these are gardens that are not only like creating space with plants, but with many reclaimed objects, old tires, broken wheels, you know, pots and pans, just all manner of things. And I was just like so stunned when I came across this book. And what I love about these gardens is that they kind of actualize a type of creative process that I'm like really fascinated by, where you're creating out of junk, the junk of the world, and even out of your own leavings. And it's also kind of ever changing. Like in a lot of these gardens, the photographer or the gardeners who she talks to note, you know, pieces get moved around or things change throughout the year. But I think I love these photographs so much because they kind of remind me, like, as creators, we're always making out of these piles of debris, whether it's like the debris of the world, the debris of memory, even the debris of our own drafts, you know, like when you look at a pile of stuff you've written or drafted and you're like, oh, sometimes feel overwhelmed by it. It's like, that is a junk heap for you to pull from and do whatever you want with. And it also kind of, there's just this one more thing I want to say, is that there seems to be a lesson to me in these gardens that feels very affirming and helps me to keep going as an artist, which is like, when you're choosing, whether it's like choosing words for a poem or choosing poems for a book or choosing objects that you're going to build these sculptures in your yard with, you're not like choosing some item or some particular component because it's the best. It's like, it's all gold and it's all garbage, but you're choosing because you're following a thread. You know what I mean? So like, I think any creative project or process is just like following a thread, like through the debris or lifting and sifting through the debris. And, yeah, these gardens have just really like sat with me, and kind of back to our previous conversation, they inspire me because they're like, remind me how powerful artworks and spaces and ways of being and politics are that like still have some of the debris on them, and have this like tenderness about cast off things, whether it's cast off objects or cast off people or cast off experiences, and just art as the work of repair, but where like the seams are still showing and the cracks and all the broken pieces. And yeah, so I really recommend this book, Places for the Spirit. Anyone who loves sculpture or loves gardens, or, you know, you could maybe call it folk art, I'm not sure, but yeah, that's that, Mike. And I know you're a photographer, so you can look these up online too. I think they're on Von Sills' website. Yeah.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
That's it. Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you so much for talking with me. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Me too, Mike. It's been great to talk with you across the continent on this, at least over here, kind of stormy Sunday, and really appreciate your time and all your thoughtful questions and all the work that you do in the world.
Oh, thank you so much. Okay, as I mentioned at the top of the episode, there are links in the show notes where you can purchase your own copy of, as I said, A Dissent. I highly recommend the book, and I also highly recommend ordering it from your own local independent bookstore. And don't forget that patrons of the show get access to the bonus audio, including today's guest, Abby Miner, reading from her work in progress, Working It. And that is our show. Editing and mixing on this episode is by me, the music is by Poddington Bear, and transcription help is by Shea Aguinaldo. If you enjoyed today's episode, tell a friend, leave a review on Apple Podcasts or Podchaser, or, just get in touch with me and let me know. You can find all of those links, contact info, transcripts, and show notes at keepthechannelopen.com. This brings us to the end of 2022 for the show, and what a year it has been. We will be back in January with a new episode. Until then, I hope your holidays are safe, warm, and that they bring a little joy and peace into your life. And as always, please remember, keep the channel open.